The autumn sun was setting over the hills of Massachusetts, painting the sky with amber and crimson hues as Elijah Blackwood meticulously organized the documents scattered across his oak desk. At 42, with prematurely gray hair and the sunken eyes of someone who slept little, he had dedicated the last 3 years of his life to an obsession that consumed every moment of his free time, clearing the name of his great-grandfather, Reverend Solomon Blackwood. His office in his Victorian home was filled with dusty boxes, yellowed newspaper clippings, and ancient diaries. The walls, covered with 19th century maps marked with red pins, traced the route of the revival camps his great-grandfather had led through the American countryside between 1875 and 1884. 79, Elijah murmured to himself, running his fingers over a newspaper clipping dated 1902. 79 children who simply vanished into thin air. The headline was sensationalist, even by the standards of the time. Preacher of Doom, the mystery of the missing children at revival camps. The article suggested that his great-grandfather, along with 2 other itinerant preachers, Reverend Isaiah Thorne and Sister Agnes Caldwell, were somehow involved in the disappearance of dozens of children over 7 years. Elijah took a sip of the whiskey he had poured hours earlier, now lukewarm. As a history professor at Boston University, he knew that the accusations against his great-grandfather had never been proven. There had been no trial, no conviction, just persistent rumors that had tainted the Blackwood name for generations. The phone rang, breaking the oppressive silence of the office. Professor Blackwood. The voice on the other end was hesitant, feminine. Yes, who's speaking? My name is Margaret Thorne. I believe we have a common interest. Elijah felt a shiver run down his spine. Thorne, the same surname as one of the other preachers mentioned in the reports. How did you get my number? He asked, suddenly suspicious. I saw your request for access to the Methodist Church archives in Springfield. My great-great-grandfather was Isaiah Thorne. There was a pause. Professor Blackwood, I found something I think you should see. A diary. It belonged to my great-great-grandmother. Elijah gripped the phone tightly. What kind of diary? The kind that contains secrets our families tried to bury for more than a century. Her voice trembled slightly. It mentions your great-grandfather and the children. The historian looked at the map on the wall, at the 3 points marked in intense red: Millfield, Ohio, Crow's Landing, Pennsylvania, and Shepherd's Grove, Massachusetts. The 3 locations where revival camps had been held, and coincidentally, where children had disappeared. Where can we meet? He asked, already reaching for a pen. Not over the phone, Margaret replied. There's something you need to understand, Professor. Since I found this diary, strange things have started happening. I feel like I'm being watched. And last night, she hesitated. Last night, I heard children singing in my backyard. When I looked out the window, there was no one there. Elijah felt his blood run cold. Two nights ago, he too had awakened to the distant sound of children singing a hymn he couldn't identify. Shepherd's Grove, he finally said. The old church is still standing. We can meet there tomorrow at noon. I'll be there, Margaret replied before hanging up. Elijah remained motionless for a few moments, the phone still in his hand. Then, slowly, he went to the bookshelf and pulled out a volume bound in worn leather. It was his great-grandfather's Bible, one of the few possessions that had survived the fire that destroyed Solomon Blackwood's house in 1884, shortly after the last revival camp. As he opened the sacred book, a folded piece of paper fell onto the desk. Elijah picked it up carefully. It was a yellowed pamphlet announcing a great revival of faith and purification of young souls in Shepherd's Grove, Massachusetts, dated August 1883. On the back of the pamphlet, written in a shaky handwriting, was a message that made Elijah's blood run cold. May God forgive us for what we did in His name. They come to me in my dreams. 79 voices singing in the darkness. 79 souls that were never recorded. The covenant cannot be undone. Outside, the wind began to blow, making the windows of the old Victorian house groan. And for a moment too brief to be certain, Elijah thought he heard, mixed with the howl of the wind, the distant singing of children. The following morning dawned grey and damp, with a thick fog that clung to the Massachusetts hills like a shroud. Elijah drove for almost 2 hours, leaving Boston behind and entering the interior of the state, where the roads became increasingly narrow and the houses more sparse. Shepherd's Grove could barely be called a town nowadays. A gas station, a convenience store, and a few dozen houses grouped around a central square where the old wooden church still stood, its bell tower pointing to the sky like an accusing finger. Elijah parked his car in front of the church and checked his watch. 11:45, he was early. He got out of the vehicle and felt the cold autumn air fill his lungs. The fog had dissipated a bit, but still lingered among the trees surrounding the small community. The church was in surprisingly good condition for a structure almost 150 years old. Someone had taken care to preserve it, although a sign on the door indicated that religious services were no longer held there. It was now a historic monument of Shepherd's Grove. While waiting, Elijah walked through the small cemetery adjacent to the church. Ancient headstones, many of them tilted by time, emerged from the tall grass. He ran his fingers over worn inscriptions, names and dates almost illegible after more than a century exposed to the elements. It was then that he noticed something strange. In a remote corner of the cemetery, partially hidden by an ancient oak, there was a monument different from the others. It wasn't a traditional headstone, but a kind of dark stone obelisk about 5 feet tall. Approaching, Elijah realized that there were no names engraved on the monument, only a number. 79. And below, an inscription in Latin, Innocentes in tenebris ambulant, the innocent walk in darkness. Impressive, isn't it? Elijah turned abruptly. A woman was standing a few meters away. Tall, with brown hair tied in a disheveled bun and penetrating green eyes, she appeared to be approximately the same age as him. She wore a brown coat over a white blouse and jeans and carried a worn leather bag over her shoulder. "Margaret Thorne?" he asked, extending his hand. She nodded, shaking his hand firmly. "Professor Blackwood, I see you've already found the monument. When was it erected?" "In 1905. From what I've discovered, it was an initiative of the town council after years of rumors and stories about the missing children." Margaret approached the obelisk. No one wanted to talk about it openly, but they also couldn't simply ignore what had happened, so they created this memorial, without names, without direct accusations, just a number. Elijah felt a lump in his throat. 79. 79 children who never returned home, Margaret completed. "Shall we go into the church? I have a lot to show you, and I prefer not to stay in the open air longer than necessary." The church door creaked when they opened it. The interior was surprisingly well preserved. Dark wooden pews aligned in 2 rows, a simple altar, colored stained glass that filtered the grey light of the day, creating multicolored patterns on the wooden floor. Margaret headed to the first pew and opened her bag, removing a book bound in faded red leather, closed with a strip of the same material. "The Diary of Elizabeth Thorne, wife of Reverend Isaiah," she explained, sitting down and inviting Elijah to do the same. "I found it hidden in a secret compartment of a family chest, in the attic of the house I inherited from my grandmother." Elijah sat down beside her, his heart racing. "May I?" Margaret hesitated for a moment before handing over the diary. "Some passages are disturbing. Elizabeth was not a happy woman, and her marriage to Isaiah was, at the very least, complicated." Elijah opened the diary carefully. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded in some places, but still legible. He began to leaf through, stopping occasionally to read excerpts. May 15th, 1880. Isaiah returned from the meeting with Solomon and Agnes. Something has changed in him. His eyes have a gleam I've never seen before. He speaks of a great purpose, of purification and true salvation. He mentioned an ancient book that Solomon found. It is not the Bible. Elijah turned a few pages. August 3rd, 1881. The camp in Millfield began today. 27 families brought their children. Troubled children, they say, possessed by rebellious spirits. Isaiah says we can save them. Solomon has a method. Agnes prepares the herbs. I don't like the smell that comes from her tent at night. A few more pages. August 17th, 1881. 11 children were purified last night. The parents were sent back home, told that their children need to stay longer to complete the treatment. They believed it. God forgive me, I said nothing. What happens in the big tent after midnight? I cannot write. I cannot even think. The screams, the singing, the smell. Elijah felt his stomach turn. He looked at Margaret, who was observing his reactions with a somber expression. "There's more," she said softly. "Much more." Elizabeth documented everything, although in some parts her writing becomes almost incoherent. She was terrified, but also felt guilty for not doing anything to stop it. "What exactly did they do with these children?" asked Elijah, his voice barely more than a whisper. Margaret took the diary back and turned several pages until she found what she was looking for. September 12th, 1882, Crow's Landing, 26 more children. Solomon says the ritual is getting stronger each time. The book he found, he calls it Liber Tenebris, the Book of Darkness, contains passages that he translates for Isaiah and Agnes. Something about a portal, about feeding ancient entities with innocence and faith. The children sing the hymn that Solomon composed while they drink Agnes's tea. Afterward, they are taken one by one behind the altar. They don't return. Solomon says they have been elevated, that their names have been erased from earthly records to be inscribed in the book of true salvation. A heavy silence fell over them. Outside, the wind had increased, whistling through the cracks in the windows of the old church. "My great-grandfather," Elijah began, his voice failing. He was the leader of all this. Margaret closed the diary. According to Elizabeth, yes, Solomon Blackwood found the book during a trip to Europe. He returned changed. He convinced Isaiah and Agnes that he had discovered a path to true salvation, one that required sacrifices. Elijah stood up abruptly, unable to continue sitting. He walked to the altar, trying to process what he had just heard. Why didn't anyone do anything? 79 children don't disappear without someone noticing. The families who sent their children to these camps were desperate, explained Margaret, joining him near the altar. Many of these children had what we would now call behavioral or mental disorders. They were considered difficult, possessed, or corrupted. The parents wanted to believe that the preachers could cure them. And when they were informed that their children needed to stay longer, or that they had been sent to another camp for additional treatment, they accepted it. And afterward, letters. Elizabeth mentions that Solomon had an assistant who forged letters, supposedly written by the children, informing that they were well, that they were being transferred to other institutions, or that they had found work in distant cities. The families received these letters for a few months, then they stopped. When they questioned, they were informed that their children had chosen to cut ties or had moved west. It was the 19th century, Professor. There were no social networks, telephones, or easy ways to verify these stories. Elijah felt a wave of nausea. And what happened to them? To Solomon, Isaiah, and Agnes? Margaret opened the diary again to the last pages. September 5th, 1883. Shepherd's Grove. The last camp, says Solomon. They need only 42 more children to complete the number. Isaiah is restless. He says he has been dreaming of the children, that they sing to him in the dark. Agnes no longer speaks. Her eyes are empty. Solomon is the only one who still believes that what we are doing is sacred. She turned the page. September 19th, 1883, it is done. 42. The total is now 79. Solomon performed the final ritual tonight. Something went wrong. The ground shook. Strange lights in the sky. The children's singing became so loud, I thought my head would explode. Isaiah is dead. He hanged himself on the big tree behind the tent. Agnes disappeared into the forest, screaming about eyes in the shadows. Solomon, something entered him. His eyes. They were no longer his eyes. He fled, taking the book. I will burn this diary. If anyone finds it, please, do not look for the book. Do not say the children's names aloud. They hear, they always hear. It was the last entry. The following pages had been torn out. Obviously, she didn't burn the diary, observed Elijah. No, but she hid it well. And as for your great-grandfather, the fire, completed Elijah. His house caught fire in 1884. His body was never found. It was presumed he had died in the flames. Margaret nodded slowly. And the book, the so-called Liber Tenebris? I've never heard of it until now. It wasn't among Solomon's possessions that survived the fire. A sudden sound made them both turn. The church door had closed forcefully, pushed by the wind that now howled outside. It's getting late, said Margaret, putting the diary back in her bag. We should leave before the storm gets worse. Elijah agreed, but when they headed to the door, they realized something was wrong. The doorknob wouldn't turn. It was locked. This is impossible, muttered Margaret, pulling the door forcefully. There was no key. We didn't lock it. A soft sound began to fill the church. At first, almost imperceptible, then gradually louder. Children's voices singing in unison, a strange and hypnotic melody. Elijah and Margaret turned slowly. The church was empty as before, but the singing continued, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Are you hearing that? Whispered Elijah. Margaret nodded, her face as pale as paper. It's the same singing I heard in my backyard. The sound grew, the childish voices intoning words in a language that neither of them recognized. And then, slowly, the church pews began to move, dragging a few centimeters to the sides as if making way. We need to get out of here, said Elijah, his voice trembling. Now! He ran to one of the windows and tried to open it, but it was stuck. He grabbed a candlestick from the altar and threw it against the glass. The candlestick bounced off the glass and fell to the floor with a dull thud, causing no damage. The singing grew louder, more insistent. And now, between the pews that had moved apart, something began to form on the church floor. A dark stain, like a thick liquid that sprouted from the wooden boards, spreading in a perfect circle. The portal, whispered Margaret, backing up to the wall. Elizabeth mentioned a portal. In the center of the dark circle, something began to emerge. A small, pale hand, followed by another. Children's hands grasping the edges of the circle as if it were an opening in a solid floor, pulling themselves up. Elijah felt his heart almost stop. It couldn't be real. It couldn't be happening. And then the singing stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying as the voices. The hands disappeared back into the dark circle, which began to contract, like ink being absorbed by the floor, until it disappeared completely. The pews slowly returned to their original positions. The church door opened with a soft click. Outside, the storm had passed. The sun was shining in a surprisingly clear sky. Elijah and Margaret looked at each other, both trembling, unable to comprehend what they had just witnessed. That was, Elijah began. Real, completed Margaret. It was real. And I think it was a warning. Or an invitation, murmured Elijah, remembering the pamphlet found in his great-grandfather's Bible. We need to find out more about this book, the Liber Tenebris, and about what really happened to Solomon Blackwood after the fire. Margaret nodded, clutching her bag to her chest. I know someone who can help us. A specialist in 19th century occultist texts. She teaches at Miskatonic University in Arkham. Arkham? That's only 2 hours from here, said Elijah, checking his watch. It was almost 3 in the afternoon, although he had the feeling that much more time had passed inside the church. We can get there before nightfall. As they left the church, Elijah couldn't help but look back one last time. For an instant, he thought he saw a figure watching them through one of the colored stained glass windows, the silhouette of a tall man wearing what appeared to be a pastor's hat. But when he blinked, the figure had disappeared. In the cemetery, the obelisk with the number 79 seemed to shine under the sunlight as if it had just been polished. And around it, although there was no wind, the grass moved gently, as if small invisible feet were walking in circles around it. Miskatonic University stood imposingly against the evening sky, its Gothic towers and dark stone facades giving it an air of antiquity and mystery that contrasted with the rest of the city of Arkham. The campus was relatively quiet that Friday afternoon, with only a few students crossing the well-maintained lawns or sitting on the steps of the staircases leading to the various buildings. Elijah parked his car in the visitors' parking lot and checked his watch. 5:40 in the afternoon. Dr. Eleanor Marsh should be in her office until 6, said Margaret, checking a message on her phone. She responded that she can receive us. They crossed the campus toward the Department of Historical and Anthropological Studies, located in one of the university's oldest buildings. The interior was a labyrinth of dark wooden corridors and doors with frosted glass panels, where the professors' names were engraved on brass plates. They found Dr. Marsh's office on the 3rd floor. A sign on the door indicated, Dr. Eleanor Marsh, Professor of Comparative Religious History and Occultist Studies. Margaret knocked softly on the door. "Come in," replied a female voice from the other side. The office was exactly as one might expect from an academic specialized in ancient texts. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with books, some visibly ancient. A large desk covered with papers, manuscripts and photographs, and various strange artifacts, statuettes, amulets, and what appeared to be a small miniature altar arranged on shelves on the walls. "Doctor." Eleanor Marsh was a middle-aged woman with short grey hair, thick-framed glasses, and an erect posture that conveyed authority. She wore a grey skirt and blazer over a white blouse, and a necklace with a strange symbol, something that resembled a 5-pointed star, but with curved lines instead of straight ones. "Ms. Thorne," she greeted, standing up to shake Margaret's hand. "And you must be Professor Blackwood." Margaret mentioned that you were researching something related to the 19th century revival camps. "Thank you for receiving us with such short notice, Dr. Marsh," said Elijah, shaking her hand. "Please, sit down," offered the professor, indicating 2 chairs in front of her desk. Margaret mentioned something about a book called Liber Tenebris. "I confess I was intrigued. It's not a text I'm familiar with, and believe me, I know most of the grimoires and occultist texts from that period." Margaret opened her bag and took out Elizabeth Thorne's diary. The book is mentioned here in the diary of the wife of one of the preachers involved in the incidents. Eleanor took the diary carefully, putting on white cotton gloves before touching it, a habit of someone who regularly deals with historical documents. She leafed through a few pages, stopping to read specific excerpts, her expression becoming increasingly serious. This is disturbing, she finally said, returning the diary to Margaret. And you believe this liber tenebris is somehow connected to the disappearance of the children? According to the diary, yes, replied Elijah. Apparently, my great-grandfather, Solomon Blackwood, found this book during a trip to Europe and brought it to the United States. The diary suggests that he used knowledge obtained from this book to perform some kind of ritual involving the children. Eleanor stood up and walked to one of the bookshelves, running her fingers along the spines of the books until she found what she was looking for. She removed a large volume bound in black leather and brought it to the desk. This is a catalogue of European occultist texts from the 18th and 19th centuries, she explained, opening the book and quickly leafing through it. If this Liber Tenebris was acquired in Europe during that period, there might be some mention of it here. And Dice, after a few minutes of searching, Eleanor stopped at a page. Here, there's a brief mention of a text called Codex Tenebris, or Liber Umbrarum, which could be translated as Book of Darkness, or Book of Shadows. Apparently, it was a manuscript attributed to an apostate monk from the 15th century, known only as Brother Malakia. What does it say about the content? Asked Margaret, leaning forward to try to see the book. Not much, unfortunately. Only that it contained blasphemous rituals designed to open portals to realms beyond human comprehension, and that it was considered heretical by the Church. Most copies were destroyed during the Inquisition, but rumors persisted that at least one copy survived, passing from hand to hand among collectors of forbidden texts. Elijah felt a shiver run down his spine. And that copy could have reached my great-grandfather's hands at the end of the 19th century. It's possible, agreed Eleanor. There was a resurgence of interest in occultist texts during that period, especially among certain intellectual and religious circles. If your great-grandfather traveled to Europe, he may have come into contact with some of these circles. The diary mentions that the book contained instructions for some kind of ritual involving children, said Margaret. Something about feeding ancient entities with innocence and faith. Eleanor frowned, closing the catalogue. That is consistent with certain obscure cults that believed innocence, especially that of children, was a source of power that could be channeled to open portals between dimensions. She hesitated. There's something else you need to know. The catalogue mentions that the Codex Tenebris contained a specific ritual that required exactly 79 sacrifices. Elijah and Margaret exchanged alarmed looks. 79, repeated Elijah. The same number of missing children. I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to this sort of thing, said Eleanor, standing up again and heading to another bookshelf. There's something more here. The ritual wasn't just to open a portal, it was to bring something through it, or someone. Who? asked Margaret, her voice barely more than a whisper. Eleanor removed another book from the shelf, this one smaller and with a red cover. This is a study on entities mentioned in various occultist texts. There's a passage. She quickly leafed through the book. Here, it speaks of an entity known by various names: the Shepherd of Shadows, the Guardian of Lost Children, the One who Walks Between Worlds. The Shepherd of Shadows, repeated Elijah, suddenly remembering the silhouette he thought he had seen in the church. What exactly is this entity? Eleanor adjusted her glasses, her face assuming a grave expression. According to these texts, it's an ancient entity that exists in the interstices between dimensions. It's not exactly evil in the traditional sense, but completely indifferent to human morality. Its nature is collector. Collector? Asked Margaret. Yes, it collects souls, specifically the souls of children, not to destroy them, but to preserve them in a state of suspension. Eternally young, eternally innocent. Eleanor closed the book. The texts suggest that this entity is attracted by ritual chants and by pure, uncorrupted faith, which only children possess. A heavy silence fell over the office. Outside, the sun had completely set, and the automatic campus lights were beginning to turn on, casting strange shadows through the windows. So my great-grandfather and the other preachers were trying to invoke this entity, Elijah finally said, using the children as offerings. It seems so, agreed Eleanor. But there's something I don't understand. Why would Christian preachers get involved with this type of ritual? It's completely contrary to everything Christianity preaches. Margaret leafed through the diary again. Elizabeth mentions that Solomon believed he had discovered a path to true salvation. Perhaps he somehow distorted what he found in the book, interpreting it through a fanatical religious lens. It wouldn't be the first time, observed Eleanor. History is full of examples of religious or occultist texts being reinterpreted to justify atrocities, especially by minds already predisposed to fanaticism. Elijah stood up and walked to the window, observing the campus lights. What happened in the church today? Those voices, that portal beginning to open. Do you think it was real? Or were we just influenced by what we read in the diary? Eleanor looked at him with an expression that mixed compassion and concern. Professor Blackwood, in my area of study, I've learned that the line between the real and the imaginary is much thinner than most people would like to believe, especially when it comes to ancient rituals and deeply rooted beliefs. So you believe something supernatural really happened at those camps? Asked Margaret. What I believe is irrelevant, replied Eleanor. What matters is what you two believe and what you intend to do about it. Elijah sat back down. We need to find this book. If it still exists, it may contain answers about what really happened to those children, and perhaps a way to free them, Margaret suggested hesitantly. Eleanor leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. If you are determined to follow this path, I need to warn you. You are dealing with forces that you don't fully understand, forces that can be dangerous. We're already involved, said Elijah, from the moment I began investigating my great-grandfather's past. And after what we saw today in the church, I understand, said Eleanor, nodding slowly. In that case, I can offer some guidance. First, we need to determine if the book still exists and where it might be. The diary mentions that Solomon fled with the book after the final ritual, Margaret reminded, and then there was the fire at his house. But his body was never found. added Elijah. It was always presumed that he had died in the flames, but what if he didn't? What if he fled, taking the book with him? Eleanor stood up again and went to a side table where there was a computer. Let's check the historical records. If Solomon Blackwood survived the fire, he may have left some trail, she typed quickly, accessing what appeared to be an academic database. Here, there are records of a man named Solomon Black, possibly Blackwood, with the name abbreviated, who bought a property in a remote area of Vermont in 1885, a year after the supposed fatal fire. That could be him, said Elijah, approaching to see the screen. Is there any information about this property? Only the location, a mountainous area near a small community called Raven's Hollow. Apparently, the property included an isolated cabin and several acres of forest. Eleanor continued searching. There's also a death record for Solomon Black, dated 1912. He would have died at 82, which would be consistent with your great-grandfather's age at that time. So he may have lived almost 30 years after the incidents, hidden in this cabin in Vermont, concluded Margaret. And the book could still be there. Or it was buried with him, suggested Eleanor. Texts like the Liber Tenebris were often buried with their owners, especially if they feared that the knowledge contained in them would fall into the wrong hands, or if they believed they would need the book in the afterlife. Elijah felt a chill. Then we need to go to Raven's Hollow, Vermont. Find Solomon Black's grave or the cabin if it still exists. Wouldn't it be better to inform the authorities? Asked Eleanor. We're talking about a potential case of mass murder, even if it occurred more than a century ago. With what evidence? Contested Margaret. An old diary that mentions supernatural rituals and an entity called the Shepherd of Shadows. We would be ridiculed. Besides, she hesitated. After what we saw in the church, I'm not sure if the authorities could do anything about it. This goes beyond the jurisdiction of the police or the FBI. Eleanor sighed. You're probably right. But please be careful. If you really find this book. She paused, as if carefully choosing her words. Don't read aloud any passage that seems to be an enchantment or ritual. Texts like this are often designed to be activated by the human voice. Understood, said Elijah. We can leave for Vermont tomorrow morning. Before you go, said Eleanor, opening a drawer in her desk, I want to give you something. She took out a small object and handed it to Elijah. It was a silver amulet, similar to the one she herself wore, a 5-pointed star with curved lines surrounded by a circle. It's a very ancient protection symbol. It may mean nothing to you, but in my field of study, we believe it offers some defense against unwanted influences. Elijah accepted the amulet, feeling its weight surprisingly comforting in his hand. Thank you. There's one more thing you should know, added Eleanor, her voice assuming a more serious tone. If the Shepherd of Shadows was really invoked through this ritual, and if the souls of these children are somehow trapped between dimensions, any attempt to interfere with this state of affairs may have unpredictable consequences. What kind of consequences? Asked Margaret. The ritual required 79 sacrifices for a reason. This number has significance in various occultist traditions. It represents a complete cycle, a fully open portal. If you somehow disturb this balance... Eleanor paused. The entity may try to restore it by collecting more souls, concluded Elijah, feeling a knot in his stomach. Eleanor nodded somberly. Exactly. Be aware that in seeking answers, you may be reopening a door that was closed a long time ago. A door that perhaps would be better left closed. When Elijah and Margaret left Dr. Marsh's office, the campus was almost deserted. The lights from the posts cast yellowish circles on the ground, creating islands of clarity in a sea of shadows. The night air was cold and damp, carrying the smell of decomposing leaves and wet earth. On the way back to the parking lot, they passed a small playground, probably used by the campus daycare during the day. The empty swings moved gently, although there was no perceptible wind, and for a moment too brief to be certain, Both thought they heard the distant sound of children's laughter, followed by an almost inaudible whisper, "Come find us, we're waiting." The road made a sharp curve, revealing a valley below them. Nestled among the mountains, a small collection of buildings formed what was presumably Raven's Hollow. A few dozen houses grouped around a main street, a church with a white bell tower, and what appeared to be a service station. "It looks normal," commented Elijah, not knowing exactly what he expected. "Places with dark secrets usually do," replied Margaret, putting away her phone. "What's the plan when we get there?" "First, we need to find the local cemetery. If Solomon was buried here as Solomon Black, there should be a grave. We also need to find out if the cabin still exists and exactly where it is." They descended the road toward the town, passing a faded sign that said, "Welcome to Raven's Hollow, founded in 1823. The main street was exactly as one might expect from a small mountain town. A row of wooden-fronted shops, a small cafe, a post office, and what appeared to be a local museum or tourist information center. Elijah parked in front of the cafe, the Hollow Cup. "Let's start here. In small towns like this, the local cafe is usually the best place to get information." The interior of the cafe was cozy, with wooden tables, a fireplace lit in one corner, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee and homemade pies. Despite it being almost noon on a Saturday, there were only a few customers, an elderly couple at a table near the window, and a middle-aged man reading a newspaper at the counter. The waitress, a robust woman of about 50 with grey hair tied in a bun, smiled when they approached the counter. Her name tag identified her as Martha. "Good morning. You're not from around here, are you?" she asked in a friendly manner. "Is it that obvious?" replied Elijah with a smile. "I know everyone in this town, dear. And tourists usually don't show up until later in the season when the leaves are at the peak of their colors." She picked up a notepad. "What can I get for you?" They ordered coffee and slices of the apple pie that Martha enthusiastically recommended. While she prepared the order, Elijah decided to start the conversation. "Actually, we're here on business. I'm a history professor researching for a book about rural New England communities in the late 19th century." "Oh, that's fascinating," exclaimed Martha, placing the coffee cups in front of them. "Raven's Hollow has quite a history, you know. The first settlers faced terrible winters here in the mountains. We're particularly interested in a resident who would have moved here around 1885, continued Elijah. A man named Solomon Black. Martha's smile faltered slightly. Black? The man from the cabin? Elijah and Margaret exchanged quick glances. Yes, exactly. Do you know the story? Martha looked around, as if checking if anyone was listening, and then leaned over the counter, lowering her voice. Everyone in Raven's Hollow knows the stories about Old Black. He lived isolated in that cabin in the mountains, rarely came to town, and when he did, he avoided talking to people. There were rumors. Well, rumors that he wasn't exactly normal. What kind of rumors? Asked Margaret. They said he talked to himself, or rather that he talked to people who weren't there, children mainly. Hunters who passed near the cabin sometimes reported hearing children's voices singing, although Black lived alone. Martha paused to serve the pie slices. Of course, that was a long time ago, probably just stories exaggerated over the years. Does the cabin still exist? Asked Elijah, trying to maintain a casual tone. Oh, yes. It's been abandoned for decades, of course. It's about 5 miles north of town, following a trail that branches off from the main road. Nobody goes there. They say the place is haunted. Martha smiled as if she found the idea amusing. But you don't believe in that sort of thing, do you? Being academics and all. We keep an open mind, replied Margaret diplomatically. And what about the local cemetery? Solomon Black would have been buried here, I presume. Yes, in the cemetery behind the church. But, Martha hesitated, his grave is a bit different. Different how? Asked Elijah. Well, most graves have crosses or angels, you know, normal Christian symbols. Black's has a kind of obelisk with strange symbols, and it's separated from the other graves in the farthest corner of the cemetery. Martha lowered her voice even more. They say the pastor at the time refused to perform a full funeral service for him. Something about non-Christian practices. Elijah felt a shiver run down his spine. That's interesting. If you're planning to visit the grave or the cabin, you should talk to Mr. Jenkins at the local museum, suggested Martha, pointing to a building across the street. He knows everything about Ravens Hollow's history. He has archives, old photographs, all that. We'll do that, thank you, said Margaret, tasting the pie. This pie is delicious, by the way. Martha smiled, clearly pleased with the compliment. My grandmother's recipe, she knew old Black, you know. She said he had the saddest eyes she had ever seen, as if he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders. After finishing their coffee and pie, Elijah and Margaret crossed the street toward the small local museum. It was a modest two-story building, with a sign in front that said Ravens Hollow Historical Society, preserving our past. The interior smelled of old books and polished wood. Glass display cases exhibited artifacts from the town's history, loggers' tools, sepia photographs of pioneer families, yellowed documents. An elderly man with a well-trimmed white beard and reading glasses was sitting behind a counter, organizing what appeared to be newspaper clippings. Welcome to our humble museum, he greeted them as they entered. I'm Walter Jenkins, curator. How can I help you? Elijah repeated the story about being a professor researching for a book, specifically mentioning his interest in Solomon Black. Mr. Jenkins adjusted his glasses, studying them with a penetrating look. Solomon Black, is it? An interesting subject. Not many people ask about him specifically. He slowly stood up. Come with me. I have something that might interest you. He led them to a room at the back of the museum, a kind of archive with metal shelves containing labeled boxes and folders. Mr. Jenkins went to a filing cabinet, opened a drawer, and removed a thick folder. This is the file I've compiled on Solomon Black, he explained, placing the folder on a table. It's not much, but it's probably the most complete collection of information about him that exists. Elijah opened the folder. It contained newspaper clippings, some old photographs, and what appeared to be a copy of a property deed. Black arrived in Ravens Hollow in the spring of 1885, explained Mr. Jenkins. He bought the property in the mountains with cash, a considerable amount at the time. He kept to himself, rarely coming to town except to buy supplies. One of the photographs showed a tall, thin man with a graying beard, wearing dark clothes that resembled the attire of a Protestant pastor, though without the clerical collar. His eyes, even in the faded photograph, seemed intense, almost feverish. It's him, murmured Elijah, recognizing familiar features from the portrait of his great-grandfather that he had seen in his grandmother's house as a child. This photograph was taken around 1900, said Mr. Jenkins. 15 years after his arrival. As far as I know, it's the only image of him that exists. Margaret pointed to a newspaper clipping. What's this? Ah, that's interesting, replied Mr. Jenkins. It's an article from the local newspaper from 1897. Apparently, some children from town disappeared in the forest near Black's cabin. They were found 2 days later, disoriented but unharmed. When questioned about where they had been, they said only that the man in the hat had invited them to sing with him. Elijah felt his heart race. And people suspected Black? Naturally. Some men from town went to his cabin but found nothing suspicious. Black denied any involvement. He said he had also heard the children singing at night, but that it wasn't him who called them. Mr. Jenkins adjusted his glasses again. After that, parents forbade their children from approaching the cabin area. Margaret was leafing through other documents in the folder. Is there anything here about a book? Perhaps something that Black considered valuable or kept hidden? Mr. Jenkins frowned, thoughtful. Not specifically a book, but... He turned and went to another shelf, removing a dusty box. After Black died in 1912, His few possessions were auctioned. Most were common items, furniture, utensils, clothes. But there was a chest that no one could open. Eventually, it was donated to the Historical Society. He opened the box and removed a small chest of dark wood, approximately the size of a shoebox, but taller. It was decorated with intricate carvings, symbols that resembled those described on the obelisk of Black's grave. A metal lock, green with time, kept it sealed. "We never managed to open it," explained Mr. Jenkins. "The lock is unusual, and we didn't want to force it to avoid damaging a historical artifact." Elijah examined the chest carefully. The symbols carved into the wood were disturbingly familiar, similar to those he had seen on the amulet that Dr. Marsh had given them. "Do you know what was inside?" he asked. "Not with certainty, but there's a story." Mr. Jenkins lowered his voice, as if sharing a secret. "They say that in the last years of his life, Black became increasingly paranoid. He talked about protecting the book and keeping the portal closed. Of course, most people thought he was senile." Margaret touched the chest hesitantly. "And what about the grave?" "Martha from the cafe mentioned that it's unusual." "That's an understatement," replied Mr. Jenkins with a short laugh. "Black left specific instructions for his funeral. He wanted an obelisk instead of a traditional headstone with those same strange symbols carved into it. And he insisted on being buried with something he called the key." "The key?" repeated Elijah. "Yes, no one knows exactly what this key was or why it was so important to him, but they respected his wishes." Mr. Jenkins closed the box, returning the chest to its place. "The grave is in the northeast corner of the cemetery, separated from the others. It's not difficult to find." Elijah and Margaret thanked Mr. Jenkins for his help and left the museum, walking toward the church they had seen upon entering the town. The cemetery was behind it, a sloping terrain surrounded by a low stone wall. "Do you think the book is in that chest?" asked Margaret as they walked. "Possibly, or perhaps it's buried with him, along with the so-called key," replied Elijah. "Either way, we need to check the grave first." The cemetery was small and well-maintained, with headstones arranged in orderly rows. As Mr. Jenkins had said, Solomon Black's grave was easy to locate, a dark granite obelisk rising solitary in the farthest corner, separated from the other graves by several meters of well-trimmed grass. Approaching, they saw that the obelisk was covered with carved symbols, the same ones that were on the chest and similar to Dr. Marsh's amulet. At the base, a simple inscription: Solomon Black, 1830-1912, the shepherd watches. "The shepherd watches," Margaret read aloud. "What a strange epitaph." Elijah circled the obelisk, examining the symbols. "These aren't random. They form some kind of pattern, perhaps a text in a language I don't recognize." He knelt to examine the base of the monument. The earth around it seemed undisturbed, with no signs that anyone had tried to dig recently. "If the book is buried here, it won't be easy to retrieve it," he observed. "We can't just start digging in a cemetery in broad daylight." "What about the cabin?" suggested Margaret. "Martha said it's about 5 miles north. We could check it first and come back here after dark, if necessary." Elijah nodded, standing up. "Makes sense. Maybe we'll find something in the cabin that will give us more clues about where the book might be." As they moved away from the grave, a sudden movement caught Elijah's attention. For an instant, he thought he saw a small figure, the size of a child, hiding behind a nearby headstone. But when he looked directly, there was no one there. "Did you see that?" he asked Margaret. "See what?" "Nothing. Must have been my imagination." They returned to the car and followed the directions Martha had given, taking the main road north and looking for the trail that would lead to Solomon Black's cabin. After about 15 minutes of driving, they spotted an opening in the forest on the right, little more than a dirt path, almost hidden by the growth of vegetation. "This must be it," said Elijah, carefully turning the car onto the narrow trail. The path was rough and clearly hadn't been used for a long time. Branches scratched the sides of the car as they slowly advanced through the increasingly dense forest. After about 20 minutes of cautious driving, the trail ended in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was the cabin, a rustic log structure with a sloping roof and a stone chimney. Despite obviously being abandoned for decades, the cabin seemed surprisingly intact. The windows were broken and the door hung from a single hinge, but the structure itself remained standing, protected by the tall trees surrounding it. Elijah parked the car and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was almost oppressive. No birdsong, no buzzing of insects, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. "It's more isolated than I imagined," commented Margaret, looking around. "No one could hear you scream here." "Comforting, thank you," replied Elijah dryly, getting out of the car. They cautiously approached the cabin. The half-open door revealed a dark interior. Elijah took a flashlight from his pocket and illuminated the path ahead. The interior of the cabin was a single large room, with a stone fireplace on one wall and what remained of simple furniture: a table, broken chairs, the remains of a bed in one corner. Decades of abandonment had left the place covered in dust, cobwebs, and dry leaves that entered through the broken windows. "Let's look for anything that might indicate where the book is," said Elijah, moving the beam of the flashlight around the room. They began to methodically examine the space. Margaret checked what remained of the furniture, while Elijah inspected the walls and floor, looking for hiding places or secret compartments. "Look at this," called Margaret after a few minutes, pointing to the wall above the fireplace. Elijah directed the flashlight to where she indicated. Carved into the wood, almost imperceptible under layers of soot, were the same symbols they had seen on the grave and on the chest. "They're everywhere," he murmured, approaching to examine them better, as if he was trying to protect the place. "Or contain it," suggested Margaret. Elijah ran his fingers over the carvings. "There's something different about these. They form a complete circle around the fireplace." He knelt and began to examine the fireplace itself. The hearth was made of flat stones, arranged in a pattern. Some of the stones seemed looser than others, as if they had been moved recently. "I think there's something here," he said, pushing one of the stones. It moved slightly, revealing a small space beneath. Using the flashlight, Elijah peered into the opening. There was something there, a metal box about the size of a thick book. "Help me move these stones," he said to Margaret. Together they carefully removed several of the hearthstones, revealing a shallow cavity. Inside was a metal box, green with corrosion but still intact. It had no visible lock, just a simple latch. Elijah carefully lifted the box out of its hiding place and placed it on the floor between them. He hesitated before opening it. "Should we?" he asked, looking at Margaret. She nodded, her face tense. "We've come too far to turn back now." Elijah took a deep breath and opened the latch. The lid of the box creaked as he lifted it, revealing its contents. A small leather-bound book, its cover black with age, and what appeared to be a key. Not a modern key, but an ornate antique one made of tarnished silver. "The Liber Tenebris," whispered Margaret. "And the key." Elijah carefully lifted the book from the box. It was surprisingly heavy for its size, and the leather of the cover felt unnaturally cold to the touch. Embossed on the cover were the same symbols they had seen on the obelisk and around the fireplace. "Should we open it?" asked Margaret, her voice barely audible. Elijah remembered Dr. Marsh's warning about not reading aloud any passages that might be rituals or incantations. "Let's just look at it for now. We should take it back to Dr. Marsh. She'll know how to handle it safely." He carefully opened the book to the first page. The text was handwritten in a language he didn't recognize. Not Latin, not Greek. Something older and more obscure. The ink was a deep, rusty brown that uncomfortably resembled dried blood. Scattered throughout the text were illustrations, intricate diagrams of what appeared to be portals or doorways, and disturbing images of elongated, shadowy figures surrounding groups of small, childlike forms. "I can't read this," said Elijah, "but the illustrations are unsettling." He turned a few more pages until he came to one that made him stop. It was a full-page illustration of a tall, thin figure wearing what appeared to be a pastor's hat and coat. The figure's face was obscured by shadows, but its eyes were clearly visible, 2 points of intense light in the darkness. Around the figure were dozens of small silhouettes, their hands raised as if in supplication or worship. Below the illustration was a caption in English. Unlike the rest of the text, "The shepherd of shadows gathers his flock." "This is it," said Margaret, pointing to the illustration. "This is what Solomon and the others were trying to invoke, the entity that took the children." Elijah nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. He carefully closed the book and returned it to the metal box, along with the key. "We should take this and go," he said. "It's getting late, and I don't want to be in these woods after dark." As they were preparing to leave, a sound from outside the cabin made them freeze. It was the sound of singing, distant, ethereal, the voices of children singing a melody that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. Elijah and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. "It's just like in the church," whispered Margaret. The singing grew louder, seeming to come from all around the cabin. And then another sound, footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. The half-open door began to move, creaking on its single hinge. "Hide!" hissed Elijah, grabbing the metal box and pulling Margaret behind the remains of a large cabinet in the corner of the room. They crouched there, hardly daring to breathe, as the door opened fully. Through a crack in the cabinet, Elijah could see the entrance to the cabin. A tall, thin silhouette stood in the doorway, backlit by the fading daylight outside. The figure wore what appeared to be a pastor's coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast its face in deep shadow. It stood motionless for a long moment, as if listening or sensing. The children's singing had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Slowly, the figure took a step into the cabin. Though its face was hidden in shadow, Elijah had the distinct impression that it was smiling. "I know you're here," said a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A voice that was both a whisper and a chorus, both ancient and youthful. "You've found my book. You've disturbed my rest." Elijah clutched the metal box tighter, feeling the cold of the metal seeping into his hands. "Show yourselves," continued the voice. "The descendants of Solomon and Isaiah, the bloodlines that began this. It is fitting that you should end it." Margaret's hand found Elijah's in the darkness, squeezing it tightly. "The children are waiting," said the voice, softer now, almost gentle. 79 souls, suspended between worlds. They sing for me, they dance for me, they are mine forever. The figure took another step into the cabin, and for a brief moment the shadow seemed to shift, revealing a glimpse of its face. Not a human face at all, but something else. Something that made Elijah's mind recoil in horror. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure was gone. The door remained open, swinging gently in the breeze. Elijah and Margaret remained hidden for several long minutes, afraid to move. Finally, Elijah dared to peek around the cabinet. The cabin was empty. "It's gone," he whispered. "For now." They emerged from their hiding place, both trembling. "What was that?" asked Margaret, her voice shaking. "I think we just met the shepherd of shadows," replied Elijah grimly. "And I think it wants its book back." They hurried out of the cabin, half expecting to find the figure waiting for them outside. But the clearing was empty, the forest silent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. As they got into the car, Elijah placed the metal box carefully on the back seat. "We need to get this to Dr. Marsh," he said, "and we need to figure out what to do about the children." "Do you think they can be saved?" asked Margaret, as Elijah started the car. "We don't know," he admitted, but we have to try. 79 souls have been trapped for over a century. If there's any way to free them. As they drove back down the narrow trail toward the main road, neither of them noticed the small figures standing among the trees, watching them leave. Dozens of pale, translucent children, their eyes hollow, their mouths open in silent song. And behind them, tall and patient, the shepherd waited, knowing that the descendants of those who had summoned him would return. They always did. The cycle would continue as it had for centuries. The book was found, the key was taken, the portal would open once more, and this time the shepherd would need more than 79 souls to satisfy its hunger. The drive back to Arkham was tense and silent. Elijah kept his eyes fixed on the winding mountain road, while Margaret occasionally glanced back at the metal box on the rear seat as if expecting it to move or change on its own. Night had fallen completely by the time they reached the outskirts of Arkham. The city lights glowed in the distance, a beacon of normalcy and safety that seemed increasingly illusory the more they learned about the dark history connecting their families. "I called Dr. Marsh," said Margaret, breaking the long silence. "She's waiting for us at her office. She said not to bring the book into her home, something about consecrated spaces and thresholds of protection." Elijah nodded, too mentally exhausted to question the precautions. After what they had witnessed in the cabin, he was willing to accept that there were forces at work beyond his understanding. Miskatonic University was eerily quiet at this late hour. Most of the buildings were dark, with only security lights illuminating the Gothic architecture, casting strange shadows across the campus grounds. The Department of Historical and Anthropological Studies was one of the few buildings with lights still on. Dr. Eleanor Marsh was waiting for them at the entrance, her face grave. "You found it," she said as they approached, her eyes immediately going to the metal box Elijah carried. "Yes," he confirmed, "and we encountered something else." "Inside," she said tersely, holding the door open. "These are not matters to be discussed in the open air." She led them through the dark corridors to her office, locking the door behind them once they were inside. The office looked different at night. The artifacts and strange symbols on the walls seemed to shift and move in the shadows cast by the desk lamp. Dr. Marsh cleared a space on her desk, laying out a cloth with intricate symbols woven into the fabric. "Place the box here," she instructed. Elijah carefully set the metal container on the cloth. Dr. Marsh studied it without touching it, her eyes narrowed behind her glasses. "This is older than I expected," she murmured. The craftsmanship of the box itself suggests early 19th century, possibly European. "There's a book inside," said Margaret, "and a key." Dr. Marsh looked up sharply. "A key? You found the key as well?" Elijah nodded. "It was with the book. We assumed it was the key that Solomon Black insisted on being buried with, according to the local historian. But it wasn't buried with him," mused Dr. Marsh. "Interesting. He must have changed his mind, hidden it with the book instead." She gestured to the box. "May I?" Elijah opened the box, revealing the ancient book and the tarnished silver key. Dr. Marsh leaned forward, studying both without touching them. "The key is not what I expected," she said after a moment. "It's not a metaphorical key, but an actual one. And judging by its design," she paused, her brow furrowed in concentration, "it appears to be much older than the book itself. Medieval, possibly even earlier." "What would it open?" asked Margaret. "That's the question, isn't it?" Dr. Marsh finally reached out and carefully lifted the book from the box, placing it on the cloth. "Let's see what the Liber Tenebris has to tell us." She opened the book with practiced care, turning the pages slowly. Unlike Elijah and Margaret, she seemed able to read at least portions of the text. "This is written in several languages," she explained as she examined the book. "Some passages in Latin, others in what appears to be a form of ancient Aramaic, and still others in a script I don't recognize. Possibly a cipher or a language that has been lost to time." She continued turning pages, occasionally pausing to study a particular passage or illustration more closely. "Here," she said finally, stopping at a page near the middle of the book. "This section describes the ritual that Solomon Blackwood and the others performed. It speaks of opening the way for the shepherd and offering the innocent to be gathered." She turned another page, revealing an illustration of a circular arrangement of stones, with symbols carved into each one. In the center of the circle stood a tall figure with a staff, surrounded by small, childlike forms. "The ritual required 79 children," continued Dr. Marsh, her voice clinical but with an undercurrent of disgust. "The number is significant. 7 and 9, both powerful numbers in various mystical traditions, multiplied together. The text suggests that this specific number creates a perfect resonance, a harmony that thins the veil between dimensions." "But what happened to the children?" asked Elijah. "Were they killed?" Dr. Marsh shook her head slowly. "Not in the conventional sense. According to this, the ritual didn't require their deaths, but their transition. Their souls were separated from their bodies, but not released to whatever afterlife might exist. Instead, they were bound to the shepherd, becoming part of its flock." "Their bodies?" asked Margaret, her voice barely a whisper. "The text is vague on that point," admitted Dr. Marsh. "It mentions a vessel emptied of essence and shells returned to earth. I suspect the children's bodies were disposed of after the ritual, buried or perhaps burned." Elijah felt sick. "And their souls? Are they conscious? Do they know what happened to them?" "That's unclear," said Dr. Marsh, turning another page. "The text suggests they exist in a state of perpetual innocence, neither fully aware nor completely unconscious. They sing, they dance, they follow the shepherd, but whether they retain their individual identities or memories..." She shrugged helplessly. "The book doesn't say." "Can they be freed?" asked Margaret, leaning forward intently. Dr. Marsh was silent for a long moment, continuing to read. Finally, she looked up, her expression troubled. "There is a way," she said slowly, "but it's dangerous. The ritual that bound them can be reversed, but doing so would require opening the portal again, the same portal that allows the shepherd access to our world. "We've already encountered it," said Elijah, describing their experience in the cabin. "It seemed to know who we were, to be expecting us." Dr. Marsh nodded grimly. "That doesn't surprise me. Entities like the shepherd exist outside our normal conception of time and space. It may have been aware of your investigation from the moment you began. So what do we do?" asked Margaret. "We can't just leave those children trapped." "No," agreed Dr. Marsh, "but freeing them will be complicated." She turned to a page near the end of the book. "According to this, the reversal ritual must be performed at the original site of the final binding, which would be Shepherd's Grove, where the last group of children was taken." "The church," said Elijah. "That's where we experience the manifestation, the singing, the portal beginning to open." "Yes, that would be the place," confirmed Dr. Marsh. "The ritual would require the book, the key, and..." She hesitated. "Blood from the descendants of those who performed the original ritual." Elijah and Margaret exchanged alarmed glances. "Our blood?" asked Elijah. "Just a small amount," assured Dr. Marsh. "A symbolic offering representing the bloodlines that began this tragedy." "And the key?" asked Margaret. "What does it open?" Dr. Marsh turned back to the illustration of the stone circle. "According to this, the key opens what the text calls the door between worlds. Not a physical door, but a metaphysical one. The ritual creates the portal, but the key is what allows souls to pass through it in either direction." "So we use the key to open this door and let the children's souls go free?" asked Elijah. "In theory, yes," said Dr. Marsh, "but there's a complication. The text warns that once the door is opened, it remains open until it's deliberately closed again. During that time, the shepherd would have free access to our world. And if it gets through," asked Margaret, "the consequences could be catastrophic." replied Dr. Marsh gravely. The shepherd doesn't just collect children's souls. It feeds on innocence, on potential. In our world, unbound by the limitations of the ritual that originally summoned it, it could potentially harvest countless souls. A heavy silence fell over the office. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows. There has to be a way to free the children without releasing the shepherd, said Elijah finally. Dr. Marsh nodded slowly. There might be. The book mentions that the shepherd is bound to the souls it has collected. They are its anchor, its connection to our reality. If the children were freed, the shepherd's hold on our world would be significantly weakened. So we perform the ritual, open the door, free the children, and then what? Asked Margaret. Then we close the door, said Dr. Marsh. With the key, but the timing would be crucial. The door would need to be closed at the exact moment the last child passes through before the shepherd can fully manifest in our world. And if we fail, asked Elijah. Dr. Marsh's expression was grim. Then the shepherd enters our world and the cycle begins again. More children would disappear. More souls would be harvested. Another silence fell, broken only by the ticking of an antique clock on Dr. Marsh's bookshelf. When would we need to do this? Asked Elijah finally. The optimal time would be at midnight on the anniversary of the final ritual, replied Dr. Marsh, consulting the book again, which, according to Elizabeth Thorne's diary, was September 19th, 1883. September 19th, repeated Margaret. That's tomorrow night. Dr. Marsh looked up, surprised. Is it? I hadn't realized the date. She frowned thoughtfully. That can't be a coincidence. The shepherd's influence may be growing stronger as the anniversary approaches. It might explain why you both began experiencing manifestations recently. So we have until tomorrow night to prepare, said Elijah. What do we need? Dr. Marsh closed the book carefully. The book itself, the key, small amounts of your blood, and she hesitated. Courage. A great deal of courage. What you're proposing to do is incredibly dangerous. We don't have a choice, said Margaret firmly. Those children have been trapped for over a century. If we can free them, we have to try. Elijah nodded in agreement. What about the chest we found at the Historical Society in Raven's Hollow? Could it be important? Possibly, said Dr. Marsh. What did it look like? Elijah described the small wooden chest with the strange symbols carved into it. Dr. Marsh's eyes widened. That sounds like a containment vessel. It might have been designed to hold something connected to the ritual, perhaps a focus object or a protective charm.